meanings given for alaka in this feminine singular are clot and leech. And in North Africa, both of these meanings are still used. Many patients have come to me to ask for a clot to be removed from their throat. And many women have come to me and told me their period didn't come. When I say, I'm sorry, I can't give you medicine to bring your period because I believe that's a baby, they would say, Mazel dim, it's still blood. So they were understanding these ideas of the Quran. Lastly, we must consider the first verses which came to Muhammad in Mecca. These are found in the 96th surah called alaq, clots, from the very word that we're studying. In 96:1-2 we read, proclaim, in the name of your Lord who created man from alaq. Here the word is in the collective plural. This form of the word can have other meanings because alaq is also the derived verbal noun of the verb alika. The verbal noun usually corresponds to the gerund in English, as in the sentence, swimming is fun. Therefore, we could expect it to mean hanging or clinging or adhering. But the 10 translators listed above have all used clot or congealed blood in this verse too. In spite of the number and qualifications of these translators who use the word clot, the French doctor Maurice Bucaille has sharp words for them. He writes, what is more likely to mislead the inquiring reader is once again the problem of vocabulary. The majority of translations describe, for example, man's formation from a blood clot. A statement of this kind is totally unacceptable to scientists specializing in the field. This shows how great the importance of an association between linguistic and scientific knowledge is when it comes to grasping the meaning of Quranic statements on reproduction. Put in other words, Bucaille is saying, nobody has translated the Quran correctly until I, Dr. Bucaille, came along. How does Dr. Bucaille think that it should be translated? He proposes that instead of clot, the word alaka should be translated as something which clings, which would refer to the fetus being attached to the uterus through the placenta. But as all you ladies who've been pregnant know, the thing which clings doesn't stop its clinging to become chewed meat. It keeps on being the thing which clings, which is attached by the placenta for 8.5 months. Thirdly, these verses say that the chewed meat becomes bones, and then the bones are covered with muscle. They give the impression that first the skeleton is formed, and then it is clothed with flesh, and Dr. Bucaille knows perfectly well that this is not true. The muscles and the cartilage precursors of the bones start forming from the somite at the same time. At the end of the 8th week, there are only a few centers of ossification started, but the fetus is already able to make muscular movement. In a personal letter from Dr. T.W. Sadler, who's associate professor in anatomy and the author of Langman's Medical Embryology, Dr. Sadler states, at the 8th week post-fertilization, the ribs would be cartilaginous, not bone, and muscles would be present. Also at this time, ossification would just begin. Muscles would be capable of some movement at 8 weeks. It's always better to have 2 witnesses, so we shall see what Dr. Keith Moore has to say about the development of bones and muscles in his book, The Developing Human. Extracted from chapters 15 and 17, we find the following information. The skeletal system develops from mesoderm. The limb muscles develop in the limb buds that are derived from this somatic mesoderm. We see that here on this slide. It's difficult perhaps to see, but there's the limb bud. And then here there's just a little bit of cartilage with the muscles around. Here there's more cartilage. And this is the whole the bones are formed and in the form of bones, but it's all cartilage. No bones yet. This second slide shows how it forms. Here's the cartilage. Now, just the bone looks like cartilage. And then it starts to have some calcium deposited. And then it starts to have ossification and bone formed. As the bone models form, I want to go back to this. As the bone models form, myoblasts develop a large muscle mass in each limb bud, separating into extensor and flexor muscles. In other words, the limb muscles develop simultaneously from the mesenchyme surrounding the developing bones. So there's the cartilage, and here are the muscles developing around the cartilage. During a personal conversation with Dr. Moore, I showed him Dr. Sadler's statement, and he agreed that it was absolutely valid. Conclusion. Dr. Sadler and Dr. Moore agreed. There is no time when calcified bones have been formed and then the muscles are placed around them. The muscles are there several weeks before there are calcified bones, rather than being added around previously formed bones as the Quran states. The Quran is in complete error here. The problems are far from being solved. Let us return to alaqa. Dr. Moore also has a suggestion. He says another verse in the Quran refers to the leech-like appearance and the chewed-like stages of human development. From this definition, Dr. Moore has gone ahead to propose that a 23-day embryo, 3 millimeters long, that's 1/8 of an inch. I can hardly put my fingers that close together without touching. This is Carnegie stage 10, shown on the inside cover of Moore's book. This is the beginning, and here's the sperm entering the egg. So that's stage 1. Comes down here to stage 6 in the second week. And here is the third week. And there's stage 10, and here is day 23. And this is what Dr. Moore wants to say looks like a leech. If we look further, though, and look at the X-ray, here's day 22, and the backbone is still open. And when we look at day 23, the backbone is open there, and it's open there, and the head is wide open. It doesn't look like a leech at all. And if you keep on, and this is a diagram of it. The head is open, the rostral neuropore. Further, though, and look at the X-ray, here's day 22, and the backbone is still open. And when we look at day 23, the backbone is open there, and it's open there, and the head is wide open. It doesn't look like a leech at all. And if you keep on, and this is a diagram of it. The head is open, the rostral neuropore. And finally, this diagram shows there is the 20-day embryo. It's got a yolk sac. It's got an umbilicus. It doesn't look like a leech at all. The great problem with these new definitions for the word alaqa is that no confirming examples have been provided from the Arabic used in the centuries surrounding the Hijra. The only way to establish the meaning of the word is by usage. The only way to establish whether the singular form alaqa can mean a 3-millimeter embryo or the thing that clings is to bring sentences demonstrating this usage from the literature of the Arabs of Mecca and Medina close to the time of Muhammad, especially from the language of the Quraysh. This will not be an easy task, because much work has already been done on the clear Arabic of the Quraysh. The early Muslims understood intuitively the need to know exactly what the Quranic words mean, and for this reason they made comprehensive studies of their language and poetry. Hamza Boubacar, former rector of the main mosque in Paris, brought up this subject at a conference on the one God in Montpellier in 1985. He posed the question to the audience: has the comprehension of the text of the Quran known at the time of Muhammad remained stable? And his answer was, ancient poetry shows that it has. We can only conclude, if the verses which bring spiritual comfort and hope to Muslims have remained stable, then the scientific statements embedded in those verses must also be accepted as stable, unless new evidence can be brought forward. This is especially important since some of the verses say that this information is a sign. The surah of the believer, as we saw above, says, He it is who created you from dust, then from a sperm drop, then from a clot, alaqa, that perhaps you may understand. And in the surah of the pilgrimage, He said, O mankind, if you have doubt about the resurrection, consider. Therefore, the question must be asked. If it was a clear sign to the men and women of Mecca and Medina, what did they understand from the word alaka, which would lead them to faith in the resurrection? The answer. We are going to examine the historical situation leading up to the time of Muhammad to see what Muhammad and his people believed about embryology. We will start with Hippocrates. According to the best evidence, he was born on the Greek island of Kos in 460 BC. And he has stages. His stages are as follows. The sperm is a product which comes from the whole body of each parent. Weak sperm coming from the weak parts, and strong sperm from the strong parts. Then he goes ahead and talks about the coagulation of the mother's blood. The seed, embryo, then is contained in a membrane. Moreover, it grows because of its mother's blood, which descends to the womb. For once a woman conceives, she ceases to menstruate. Then about flesh, he says at this stage, with the descent and coagulation of the mother's blood, flesh begins to be formed with the umbilicus. And lastly, bones, he says, as the flesh grows, it is formed into distinct members by breath. The bones grow hard and send out branches like a tree. Next, we will look at Aristotle. In his book on the generation of animals, sometime about 350 BC, he gives his stages of embryology. And he talks about first semen and menstrual blood, or catamenia. In this section, Aristotle speaks of the male semen as being in a pure state. It follows that what the female would contribute to the semen of the male would be material for the semen to work on. In other words, the semen clots the menstrual blood. Then he goes to flesh. He says nature forms this from the purest material, the flesh. And from the residue thereof it forms bones. And lastly, around the flesh, around the bones, and attached to them by thin fibrous bands, grow the fleshly parts. Clearly, the Quran follows this exactly. Sperm clotting the menstrual blood, which forms meat, then the bones are formed, and lastly, around about the bones, grow the fleshly parts. Next, we will consider Indian medicine. The opinion of Charaka in 123 AD and Susruta is that both the male and female contributed seed. The secretion of the male is called the sukra, semen. The secretion of the woman is called artava or sanita, blood. And it is derived from the blood by way of food, by way of blood. Here we see that in the medicine of India, they too had the idea that the child was formed from semen and blood. Now we shall look at Galen. Galen was born in 131 AD in Pergamum, modern Bergama in Turkey. Galen says, on semen, the substance from which the fetus is formed is not merely menstrual blood, as Aristotle maintained, but menstrual blood plus the two semens. The Quran agrees with Galen here when it says in Surah 76:2, we created man from a drop of mingled sperm. Now we'll look at the Galen stages. Galen also taught that the embryo developed in stages. The first is that in which the form of the semen prevails. The next stage is when it has been filled with blood, and heart and brain and liver are still unarticulated and unshaped. This is the period that Hippocrates called fetus. The Quranic Surah 22:5 reflects this saying. Then out of a morsel of flesh, partly formed and partly unformed. And now the third period of gestation has come. Nature caused flesh to grow on and around all the bones. We saw above that the Quran agrees with this. In Surah 23:14, where it says, and we clothe the bones with meat. The fourth and final period the fourth period is at the stage when all the parts in the limbs have been differentiated.